Today we're making charm square Halloween buckets. These buckets are big enough for all the candy you could want and even stand up on their own. The patchwork is super fun and easy to make with 5-inch charm squares. You only need one charm square pack to make this bucket, but you can mix and match if you want or throw in some scraps. Charm squares are 5-inch squares that are pre-cut for you and come in a pack, typically with all the prints from one collection. The patchwork is easy to sew with this quick method, and you only need a few other supplies, so let's get started. I'm using this line called Hey Boo, which is really cute. It has some fun prints and fun colors like pinks, purples, whites, and oranges, and some super cute prints like ghosts and spider webs. Another cute line if you want a more classic black and orange Halloween is called Sophisticated Halloween, and I'll link to both of these in my description. You're also going to need some double fold bias tape. Just pick a color that matches your line. A ½ yard of contrast, this will be the lining and the handle. Fusible interfacing, and then also fusible fleece. We'll need a rotary cutter, and a long ruler is helpful for this project, and a fabric marker. Download the pattern from my website. This is a free download. Just click the link in the description. It'll print out on 2 pages, and then you can tape them together. This has the pattern piece for the base and the handle. We'll make the body of the bag using the charm squares. Now open up your charm pack, and we're going to pick out 28 squares to use in the bucket. Sew 2 squares together, and then continue sewing squares together until you have a strip with 7 squares. Press the seam allowances flat all in one direction. Sew a total of 3 rows, each with 7 charm squares. Now grab your acrylic ruler, and we are going to cut these strips in half. Since we started with 5-inch squares, we're going to cut them a width of 2½ inches wide. Now we're going to lay the strips out in a half brick pattern. You can decide where to put each strip, and you can even flip them for more variety. To make the half brick pattern, we'll pay attention to where the seams are. We're going to line up the seam of one strip in the middle of one of the other blocks. Pin in place to keep your seam allowances going the direction you want, and then sew together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've sewn that, flip it open and pin the 3rd row to the panel. Repeat until you've sewn all 6 rows together. Now flip your panel over and press all the seam allowances down. Now we're going to use our rotary cutter and ruler to cut off the extra half bricks on each edge. Trim off the fabric so that it is squared up, and then repeat on the other side. Your panel should be about 12½ inches by 29 inches. If it is a little shorter than 12½ inches, that's okay. Now we're going to back the panel with fusible fleece. This will give the bucket stability so that it can stand up on its own. Lay the fusible fleece with the adhesive side up. This will be the scratchy side. And then put the patchwork panel down on top of it, facing up. Use an iron to press well to fuse the fleece to the panel. Trim off the excess fleece. Now we're going to top stitch the panel with a quilting pattern. I like to do straight lines across the panel about 1/4 inch from the horizontal strip seams. So I'll do 1 on each side of each seam, but you can really do any pattern here. Those quilting lines just give it that extra quilty look. The last step for the panel is to sew a line of stay stitching across the bottom. This is just regular length stitching, sewn at 3/8 inch across the bottom. This will help us piece our base to the panel. Now we're going to use the pattern piece to cut out 2 base pieces. Make sure the fold line on the base pattern piece is on a fold. You can either cut a rectangle 12.5 inches by 29 inches or use your quilted panel as a pattern piece to cut out this piece. Now we're going to turn the panels into a cylinder to create the bucket. So line up the short edges of your panel and sew across with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then repeat with the lining. Fuse fleece interfacing to the back of one of your base pieces. Then stay stitch around the base pieces 3/8 inch from the edges. Before we sew the base to the main panel, we're going to use our fabric marker to mark quarter points on our cylinder and our base piece. This will help us match them up evenly. Fold your cylinder in half and mark the halfway point. Use the seam as the other side. Then match up that seam with the pin, and then fold in half and mark those quarter points. To mark the quarter points on the base piece, fold in half so you have a half circle and mark in those folds on both sides. Then match up those points and mark the other quadrants. To assemble, we'll start by pinning those quarter marks to help us evenly space the base piece. Once you have the quarters pinned, come in and pin more in between those quadrants. The stay stitching will help you get the fabrics evenly pinned. Then sew around the base 3/8 inch from the edge. Clip the seam allowance with the end of your scissors. Repeat the process with your lining fabrics. To assemble the bucket, turn your main piece right side out with the lining inside out, and then place the lining inside the main bucket. Pin the layers together and then baste around the top to hold them together. Open up your bias tape and we're going to sandwich this over the top edge of the bucket and then hold it in place with clips. When you get back to where you started, press under about 1/4 inch of the bias tape and overlap it. Then top stitch all the way around the bucket to hold the bias tape in place. Cut a handle piece using your pattern piece, or just cut a strip of fabric 5 inches by 21 inches, back with lightweight fusible interfacing. Press in half and then press the long edges into the middle to meet. Now press over again to match the folded edges. And then top stitch on both sides of the handle about 1/8 inch from the edges. Press under about 1/4 inch on both of the short edges. Lay your bucket out on the table and find halfway points by folding it in half. Mark the points with pins. This is where we will sew the handles. Pin the handle inside of the bucket about 1.25 inches below the rim. Now sew over the end of the handle. Sew a square and then sew an X through it. Go over this at least 2 times to give the handle a good hold, and then repeat on the other side. Thanks for watching. For more charm square projects, click above.